There's an old saying that goes something like this: choose your friends wisely. They have the power to make or break you. Now, on the surface, this might sound like a pretty obvious bit of wisdom, but let's be honest. How many of us have let someone into our lives without a second thought, only to find out later that we'd made a huge mistake? While most of the time we're able to learn from these experiences, that's not always the case. Sadly, that's exactly what happened to the person at the center of today's story. By the time he realized that he'd let someone dangerous not only into his life, but into his home, it was already far too late. In the early morning hours of August 27, 2005, a man named Marcus Castellano was getting impatient. It was almost 2 a.m., and for more than an hour he'd been standing outside the arrivals terminal at Philadelphia International Airport. Marcus was waiting for his friend, 28-year-old Christian Rojas. Christian had agreed to pick him up, but so far, he hadn't showed. Eventually, Marcus managed to get a hold of another friend who was able to come and grab him from the airport instead. Now, by this point, it was getting really late and Marcus wanted nothing more than to just go home. However, the more he thought about the situation, the more it started to nag at him. Christian was normally really reliable. I mean, that's why Marcus had asked him to pick him up at the airport in the first place. The idea that Christian had simply forgotten and left him stranded was hard to believe. Not only that, but Marcus had tried to call the 28-year-old several times after landing. All of these calls had gone to voicemail. Marcus was so bothered by this, in fact, that when his other friend came to get him, he asked if he could do him another huge favor. He wanted to swing by Christian's apartment to see if everything was all right. After Marcus explained his concerns, the friend agreed. Christian's residence was in the town of Bensalem, about 30 miles from the airport. He lived in a complex called the Longmeadow Apartments, a series of 2-story row houses which were all built around a central courtyard. Each of the houses was separated into 2 units. One was on the top, and the other, like the one that Christian rented, was on the ground floor. When Marcus and his friend arrived that morning, they found Christian's unit completely quiet. All of the lights were off and the front door was locked, with repeated knocks going unanswered. As a last resort, Marcus remembered that Christian sometimes kept the back sliding glass door to his apartment unlocked. Sure enough, when he went around, it opened for him easily. He made his way inside, calling out Christian's name several times. Once again, there was no answer. However, Marcus was quickly struck by a different sound. It was the noise of something crunching underneath his feet. After feeling around for a light switch and flicking it on, he realized what this was. There was broken glass all over the floor. That wasn't all, though. Christian's entire apartment looked like it had been turned upside down. While this was incredibly unsettling, Marcus forced himself to keep moving forward, continuing to call out for Christian as he went. No matter how many times he did this, he was met with silence. He finally discovered why when he got to the bathroom. He pushed open the door just long enough to catch a glimpse of what was on the other side. There was a man's body lying in the tub. The entire area was surrounded by blood. That's when Marcus called 911. When detectives with the Bensalem Police Department arrived, they were the first ones to get a full picture of the horrifying scene in the bathroom. Christian Rojas was lying dead on his back inside of his tub, his face covered with a pillow. This pillow was removed, revealing a tube sock which had been wrapped tightly around his neck. Another one had been stuffed into the 28-year-old's mouth. His hands and feet were bound with electrical cords. Christian had suffered numerous wounds to his head and face, ones that were so bad that investigators initially thought they had been inflicted with a knife. Disturbingly, it would later be determined that these had instead been caused by repeated hits with some kind of hard, blunt object. There were further injuries to his chest, consistent with either being punched or kicked extremely hard in the sternum. As if all of this wasn't disturbing enough, there was the blood. which told a disturbing story about how the crime had unfolded. In particular, imprints on the tile of the bathtub area that appeared to show that Christian's head had been repeatedly slammed into the wall, likely as he was already restrained but still standing up. The tub itself was filled with bloody water, the color of which had since turned black due to oxidation. The rest of Christian's apartment painted a similarly terrifying picture. There was blood on the walls and floor of the hallway, suggesting that this is where everything had started. As previously noted, the place had been absolutely ransacked. Broken items were scattered all over, couch cushions had been ripped open, and styrofoam beads that looked like they had come from some sort of stuffed toy were everywhere. It was almost like whoever had done this was looking for something specific. Investigators wondered, was this a robbery gone wrong, or something else entirely? Because of the sheer amount of injuries the 28-year-old had sustained, detectives would have to wait for an autopsy to be completed until an exact cause of death could be determined. Still, one thing was perfectly clear. Christian Rojas' final moments had been a real-life nightmare. Authorities were now left with two equally obvious, yet unsettling questions. Who could have possibly done something like this, and why? While some members of the investigative team continued to process the crime scene, others turned their attention to finding out as much information as they could about the victim. They started with the person who had alerted them to the crime, Marcus Castellano. Marcus explained that Christian was originally from Costa Rica. In fact, that's where the two of them had first met. They had remained friends ever since, and when Christian said he was moving to the United States in 2003, Marcus had suggested he move to his own hometown of Ben Salem. For the last couple of years, Christian's life had seemed like the textbook example of an American success story. He was a talented computer programmer and web developer, and was able to find good jobs working for a couple of different companies. In the meantime, he was enjoying everything that his new life had to offer. He went to amusement parks and concerts, enjoyed video games and movies, and especially liked traveling around the United States to see more of the country. Of course, Christian had never forgotten about where he came from. Despite making the most of his life in the US, for the most part, he lived very modestly and sent a lot of the money he made to his mother and sisters back in Costa Rica. He kept in touch with them constantly and tried to stay as connected as possible even though he was so far away. When asked about whether Christian had any enemies, Marcus said no way. Christian was one of the nicest people he'd ever met. He was by no means the loudest person in the room, but he connected with others very easily. He was also really smart. He had attended a gifted high school back where he grew up in San Carlos, located about 30 miles northwest of the capital of San Jose. He had also been the first person in his family to attend university. Detectives quickly spoke to other friends of Christian's who told them more of the same. They had no idea who could have done something like this. The 28-year-old was incredibly kind and trusting, arguably to a fault. Pretty much everyone who got to know him had nothing but good things to say about him. Back at the crime scene, though, investigators had uncovered a couple of additional details. Ones that they thought could suggest that this was no random robbery. The first of these potential clues was found in the bathtub alongside Christian's body. Bizarrely, someone had emptied a box of condoms into the water. The prophylactics were unused and still wrapped, so they wouldn't provide any useful DNA. However, authorities wondered if they might indicate a potential motive. Maybe this was a sign that the crime was related to some kind of romantic relationship gone wrong. Detectives became even more curious about this theory when a second detail caught their attention. Scattered amongst the mess of items in the 28-year-old's ransacked apartment was a framed photo. It was of Christian, another man, and a woman. The picture had clearly originally been up on a nearby wall, but had been thrown onto the ground with enough force that the glass from the frame had shattered. Police wondered, was there something about this particular photo that had angered the perpetrator? Was it possible that Christian was involved in some kind of love triangle. No sooner had detectives uncovered these details when they received a major surprise. They were told that someone had shown up at the Bensalem PD headquarters asking to speak with police. It was the same man who they had just seen in that shattered photo. Needless to say, investigators were eager to speak to this person, and they quickly sat down with him for an interview. Just as an aside, none of the sources that we came across mention this man's real name, so to make things a little easier to follow, we're just going to refer to him as Paul. Anyway, Paul told detectives that he came to the station because he had heard about what had happened to Christian, and he wanted to help in whatever way he could. Immediately, they asked him about the picture they found at the apartment. Paul said the photo was of him, Christian, and his wife, and had been taken back when they were roommates together. Initially, when Christian moved in, Paul and his wife had just been friends. However, as their relationship got more serious, Christian had found his own place to live to give them some privacy. Investigators were intrigued by this, and asked Paul if Christian had ever expressed feelings for his wife. Paul said no, it wasn't like that at all. Christian was never romantically interested in her, and the whole situation with the move-out really hadn't been tense at all. Christian was happy for them, and they had remained friends ever since. While authorities weren't ready to rule Paul out just yet, he still provided them with two pieces of information that he thought might be potentially useful. He said that Christian drove a dark green four-door 1998 Saturn sedan. The vehicle had been given to him by a supervisor at the company where he worked, and it was nowhere to be found at the parking lot of Christian's apartment complex. Paul also mentioned that a few months earlier, Christian had briefly dated someone. He thought the woman's name might be Heather, but he wasn't sure about her last name. This last bit of information was intriguing to detectives for two reasons. For starters, the fact that Christian had an ex-girlfriend could fit with their working theory about the murder involving some kind of relationship gone wrong. Second, by this point, they had also found two voicemails that had been left on the 28-year-old's phone, both of which had been left by an unknown woman. In the first message, this woman seemed very desperate and begged for Christian's help. Interestingly, it also seemed like Christian might be avoiding her.
Christian, please, I don't know what else to do. You said you would help me. I need your help really badly, please. Why won't you please talk to me? I really, really need to talk to you. Please answer the phone.
The second message was a lot more abrupt and aggressive. It seemed that whoever this woman was, she wasn't going to let Christian ignore her.
Christian, call me the back now.
After receiving these two major leads from Paul, detectives put out an all-points bulletin for Christian's missing green Saturn. They also reached out to a bunch more of the 28-year-old's friends, asking them if they knew anything about a mysterious ex-girlfriend of his named Heather. Before they could hear back about any of this, though, investigators received another important update. It concerned Christian Rojas' autopsy, which by now had been completed. The results added even more disturbing context to the already brutal situation. For starters, though the 28-year-old had sustained at least 15 serious blows to the head, his actual cause of death had been strangulation. Heartbreakingly, the medical examiner stated that based on the available evidence, Christian's death had been a slow and agonizing one. He had likely suffered for quite some time, and it looked like many of his wounds had specifically been inflicted to cause pain rather than to kill him straight away. The ME also estimated that Christian had been dead for approximately 36 hours before he was found. This meant that the murder had happened sometime between the afternoon and evening of March 25th. The final thing that the autopsy noted was that Christian had no defensive wounds on his body. This likely meant that whoever was responsible had been able to overpower him and immobilize him before he could fight back. Detectives had only just started to wrap their heads around all this new information when yet another tip came in about the murder, one that introduced an entirely new theory completely different from what authorities had considered so far. The tip came from a journalist at a local newspaper called the Bucks County Courier-Times, who said that they had received an email from a friend of Christian's who lived out of state. The friend stated that he had reason to believe that the 28-year-old's murder might be related to his job. The email went on to explain that Christian had recently been offered a dream job, one that would actually allow him to move back to Costa Rica so he could be closer to his family while still making good money. An American company was relocating to the Central American nation, and they wanted Christian on board because they had heard he was very talented and could be a huge asset. For the 28-year-old, this was sort of the perfect situation. He loved his life in the US, but of course, he also missed his family. This job would allow him to be with the people he loved, while also returning to the United States frequently for business. While this may have been an ideal situation for Christian, his friend claimed that not everyone was thrilled about it. Namely, his current employers, who relied on him heavily. It went further, though. The company that Christian worked for was owned by two brothers. Brothers who the friend said had a shady background. Specifically, they had ties to the Italian mob. The friend finished his email by stating that Christian had been afraid about what might happen to him if he tried to leave his company. After being sent this email, detectives were a little skeptical. The suggestion that Christian's death might be a mob-related killing was a pretty big allegation, especially since by all accounts the 28-year-old wasn't involved in any illegal activity. Still, when authorities looked into the actual information provided in the email, they had to admit the claim wasn't baseless. It turned out that the brothers Christian worked for did have family members who were in the mob, with one of their connections specifically being a known hitman. It was enough that police brought in the brothers for questioning. During that interview, the brothers admitted that they weren't thrilled about Christian leaving their company, but that was only because he was a really good employee. In the end, they were ready to wish him the best of luck with his new opportunity. They really liked Christian and wanted him to do well. As for the idea that this was somehow a mob-connected hit, the brothers said that was ridiculous. Christian wasn't involved in anything that would have gotten him mixed up in something like that. Interestingly, though, they did have an idea about what might have motivated his murder. They asked detectives, had they checked Christian's safe? The 28-year-old had made it known to them, as well as several others, that he wasn't the biggest fan of banks. Because he sent so much money abroad, he also liked to cash his paychecks and convert them directly to money orders. This was completely new information to investigators. Despite thoroughly processing the crime scene by this point, they hadn't come across anything like this. It seemed that in addition to Christian's car, this safe was also missing. While the crime now looked like it may have been a robbery after all, detectives were still clearly missing something. Luckily, that would change when they heard back from some more of Christian Rojas' friends, who said that they knew the identity of his mysterious ex-girlfriend. Her name was Heather Lavelle. The more police learned about her, the more concerned they became. Upon being handed the name of Christian Rojas' former girlfriend by some of his friends, investigators with the Ben Salem PD asked as many questions as they could about the pair's relationship. According to the friends, the whole thing had been a pretty big deal for Christian. He didn't date that often, so they were initially excited at the news that he had met someone. Unfortunately, the romance didn't last very long. Sources contradict each other about exactly how long Christian and Heather were together, but at the most, it was 3 months. A few say that they were only dating for 1 month, but what seems to be confirmed is that the relationship had started in February of 2005. At first, things appeared to be going well. Heather was a tall, attractive woman who seemed to have her life together. Like Christian, she had a post-secondary education and had a good job in the insurance industry. In fact, she had recently been promoted to a VP position which paid her about $140,000 a year. However, within just a short amount of time of them getting together, Christian realized that not everything was what it seemed. It turned out that Heather was addicted to crack cocaine, and the drug was quickly taking over her life. Friends said that Christian was not a fan of drugs in general, and not long after he found out about Heather's secret, he broke off the relationship. For the next few months, Christian hadn't heard much from Heather. That was, until a couple of weeks before his murder. Heather said that she was in a bad situation and was desperately in need of help. By this point, she had lost not only her job, but her home as well. This explained the voicemails that authorities had found on Christian's phone. They had been left by Heather after all. While the voicemails hadn't given any indication what had happened after that, Christian's friend said that shortly after Heather left the messages, he reached out to her. Being the kind person he was, the 28-year-old couldn't stand the idea of someone he cared about being out on the streets with nowhere to go. He let Heather sleep on his couch, and apparently she had been staying with him for about a week at the time of the murder. Needless to say, this set off alarm bells for detectives, especially when they looked up Heather's name in their database and learned that she had been involved in 2 recent interactions with the police. The first of these incidents appeared to back up what Christian's friends had said about Heather's drug addiction. She had been arrested for possession of drug paraphernalia back in June. The second interaction was more recent and was even more interesting. Heather had been involved in a domestic situation with a 39-year-old man named James Savage. The police report about the incident said that Heather Lavelle had called police after she went to James's apartment to get her belongings and he wouldn't let her. Ultimately, Heather had decided not to pursue any charges when officers showed up. That wasn't the part that caught the attention of detectives, though. It was the fact that the report listed James Savage as being Heather's boyfriend. With this, investigators began to speculate that perhaps they had been right all along. Maybe Christian had been caught up in some kind of love triangle. A look into James Savage's background only made this theory more plausible. The 39-year-old's former wife had previously accused him of threatening her with a rifle and had gone on to obtain a protection from abuse order against him. James was also known to be addicted to crack. Remembering the condoms in the bathtub at the crime scene, it felt like the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together for detectives. Maybe when Heather started staying with Christian, he got the wrong idea. Perhaps James thought Christian was trying to get back together with her and had flown into a jealous rage. After all, the crime had all the hallmarks of being personal. It was incredibly brutal, and it looked like whoever had done this wanted Christian to suffer. Not only that, but James was 6'4" and well over 250 pounds. He would have been more than capable of overpowering Christian during a physical altercation, just as the evidence had suggested. With all of this information in hand, detectives were growing more and more confident that they were on the right track. Of course, in order to find out for sure, they would need to actually locate James Savage and Heather Lavelle. As they were about to learn, though, no one had seen either of them in days. After narrowing the focus of their investigation to 2 main suspects, investigators with the Bensalem PD began to try and track them down. Since Heather Lavelle had no current address, they started with James Savage's apartment. When detectives arrived at the residence, which was located in the neighboring community of Croydon, they were greeted by James's mother, Jackie. She said that neither her son nor Heather were there, but confirmed that they had been together when she had last seen them a few days earlier. She also said something else that immediately caught investigators' attention. During this last interaction, Heather and James had been driving a dark green 4-door car that she had never seen before. The vehicle was an exact match to the one that was missing from Christian Rojas' apartment. Detectives asked Jackie if she knew where her son and his girlfriend had been headed. She said James had mentioned something about going to the shore for the weekend, though unfortunately, he hadn't been any more specific than that. After detectives explained what was going on, though, Jackie agreed to call her son to try and get some more information out of him.
Hello?
Jimmy,
What?
what's going on? You told me, that you were going to the shore. Are you all right?
Are the police looking for me? Yeah.
Can you wire me money?
I don't know where you are to do that. Maybe you should call and talk to the cops.
No.
And tell them what's going on.
No.
Maybe she can call.
What do you tell you? Who can call?
Heather.
Why? She don't want to talk to me either.
I love you. I don't know what's going on, son. If you guys are in trouble, then you need to talk to the cops or something to find out.
No, we can't talk to the cops. Can you wire me any money or not?
Where?
Bye.
As you just heard, that call didn't go as well as police had hoped. James was suspicious, and it seemed like he almost immediately sensed that something wasn't right. One thing was clear, however. He and Heather seemed desperate. After determining that neither one of them had other relatives nearby, authorities concluded that James and Heather were likely paying for accommodation somewhere. They started searching local hotels and motels, and quickly got another massive lead. It turned out that on the night of the murder, so August 25th, James and Heather had stayed at a comfort inn right on the edge of Bensalem. They had checked out the next morning, but detectives were able to obtain surveillance video that proved that they had been there. The footage also showed that, just as authorities had suspected, they were driving Christian Rojas' green Saturn. Detectives got their next big lead when they traced James's cell phone after the call with his mother. It showed that they had been in Delaware, specifically at a motel in the town of Dewey Beach, right next to the Atlantic coast. When authorities arrived at the motel, they once again discovered that James and Heather were already gone. However, investigators were now pretty sure they knew which direction they were headed. Not only that, but the couple had left behind valuable evidence at this motel as well. Towels hanging in the bathroom had black and red stains on them, which detectives determined was from hair dye. James and Heather were trying to change their appearances, but now they knew exactly what to look for. The game of cat and mouse finally came to an end on September 2nd, when a park ranger spotted James and Heather in Nags Head, North Carolina. At first, he simply tried to pull them over for passing in a no-passing zone. However, when they sped off, the ranger sensed that something was off. He ran their plates and discovered that the green Saturn they were traveling in was tied to an open murder investigation. The situation led to a high-speed pursuit, one in which James and Heather reached speeds close to 100 miles per hour trying to escape. When their tires were punctured and the vehicle immobilized using stop sticks, they tried to run away on foot. However, both of them were eventually caught and placed under arrest. At the time, Heather's hair was dyed jet black, and James's was a weird reddish-orange color. A search of the stolen Saturn revealed even more incriminating evidence. There were a bunch of clothes and other possessions that belonged to Christian Rojas inside, some of which had his blood on them. The most disturbing item by far, though, was a set of brass knuckles. These also had blood on them, causing investigators to conclude that this was the weapon that had been used to savagely beat the 28-year-old. Now at this point, detectives pretty much had everything they needed to build a strong case against James and Heather. All the same, they wanted to interview both of them to fill in any details they might be missing, and to see if they could obtain confessions. James was the first one to be questioned, and immediately tried to tell investigators a ridiculous lie. When asked about what had happened, he admitted that both he and Heather had been present at the time of the murder, but said that neither of them were responsible. Instead, he claimed that they had been hanging out together at Christian Rojas' apartment when 3 random black guys showed up. They attacked Christian, he said, and he and Heather had only barely made it out alive. He stated that they stole the green Saturn purely to escape from the scene. James's second version of events was also a fabrication, though it was slightly more coherent. This time he claimed that he and Heather went to Christian's apartment on the night of August 25th in order to confront him. He stated that they did this after Heather told him that Christian had sexually assaulted her. James said that when they went to Christian's place, things got out of hand. He framed it as self-defense, though, stating that he only hurt Christian after he attacked him first. When Christian picked up the set of brass knuckles, James said that he was forced to fight back, He disarmed the 28-year-old, then hit him a couple of times, causing him to fall to the ground. James said that at first he and Heather simply thought Christian was unconscious, so they left him there while they went out for a bit. However, when they returned, they realized that he was actually dead. At that point, they panicked. He said that they bound Christian's limbs and threw him in the bathtub, then ransacked the house to make it look like a robbery. Of course, this didn't map on at all to the evidence detectives had found at the crime scene. By now, they knew that Christian's death had been a brutal, intentional, and sustained attack. Still, after a while it became clear James was sticking to his obvious lie. With that, detectives moved on to questioning Heather. At first, this interview was similarly unproductive. Heather refused to say much and didn't seem interested in talking. At some point, though, that changed. Detectives listened in horror, as in a cold, matter-of-fact way, she began to describe what had really happened. Heather started off by confirming the one part of James's story that had been true. She had told him that Christian had sexually assaulted her. She said that she made it up to make him angry so that he would agree to help her rob him. It turned out that James didn't need much convincing. Ever since he had learned about Heather's previous relationship with Christian, he had been insanely jealous of him. Besides, they both needed money for drugs anyway. Heather explained that initially the plan had just been to steal Christian's safe. This had been painfully easy. Christian was so trusting, he had given her a key to his apartment when he let her stay at his place. So on the afternoon of August 25th, they used that key to go inside and take the safe. However, after breaking it open, Heather and James discovered that there was no money inside. Both furious and convinced Christian must have hid the cash somewhere else in his apartment, they went back there and waited inside for him to come home from work. As soon as he walked in that evening, they ambushed him. By the time Christian realized what was going on, it was too late. James was able to overpower him. He beat him with the brass knuckles, and together they bound his arms and legs with electrical cords. Then, they took him into the bathroom. Once Christian was taken to the tub, James continued to beat him. He and Heather demanded to know where the rest of the 28-year-old's money was, but he said he didn't have any. He had sent it all back to his family in Costa Rica. No matter how many times Christian repeated this, Heather and James didn't believe him. While it's unclear exactly how long this heinous interrogation lasted for, as previously mentioned, it went on for some time. At some point, Heather said she shoved a sock in Christian's mouth because they were worried the noises he was making would be heard by the neighbors. Heather said that they spent a good chunk of time ransacking the apartment looking for valuables. All the while, Christian lay in agonizing pain in the bathroom. Eventually, when they felt that they had found everything worth taking, she claimed James finished Christian off. She said he did it while she was out of the room, the same time that he'd thrown the condoms in the bathtub. After that, they fled in Christian's car. When it was all over, they had gotten away with a laptop, a gaming console, and $40 cash, as well as the random assortment of items police had found in the vehicle after the high-speed chase. They pawned what they could while they were on the run, but they had gotten so little that by the second or third day they were on the road, they already had to resort to stealing again. This was the haul that had cost Christian Rojas his life. After giving these statements, James Savage and Heather Lavelle were both charged with first-degree murder. Facing possible death sentences, both of them eventually agreed to plea deals in exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table. Despite this, when it came time for sentencing, both Heather and James claimed the other was the true mastermind behind what had happened to Christian. Heather stated that James had been in complete control of her and had been the main aggressor, that the whole thing had been motivated by his jealousy. James, meanwhile, claimed that he never would have taken part in what had happened if it weren't for his drug use and the fact that Heather had lied about being assaulted. He further claimed that after realizing that Heather had made it all up, he wanted to turn himself in, but she wouldn't let them, saying in part, quote, "She said we were like Bonnie and Clyde. She thought it was fun." While the judge accepted the fact that Heather and James's actions were at least partially due to their drug addictions, she rejected both of their claims that they had only participated in the crime because of the other one. In the end, both of them were sentenced to life in prison. At the time of this recording, James Savage remains incarcerated at SCI Phoenix in Collegeville, while Heather remains incarcerated at SCI Muncie in Muncie, Pennsylvania. If you've been watching this channel for a while now, then you probably know that I come away from most of these cases with pretty mixed emotions. That's not the case with today's story. This one pretty much overwhelmingly made me angry. I think most of that is because of the sheer senselessness of what happened here. Christian Rojas was a promising and talented young man who did his best to take care of the people around him. He was repaid for that kindness by being betrayed and killed in one of the most horrifying ways imaginable. And at the end of the day, it was for nothing. I think what left an even worse taste in my mouth was when I stumbled across a TEDx talk that Heather Lavelle had given from prison. In it, she talks about the road to redemption and forgiving herself for what she did. Now look, I'm not against the idea of forgiveness. In fact, for better or for worse, I'm one of those people that wants to believe that no human being is truly beyond redemption. That being said, you have to mean it. And personally, after watching what Heather had to say, I didn't believe her. It's hard to put into words exactly what bothered me so much about this talk, but I've thought about it for a while, and I think it's this. You know when you can kind of tell how someone really feels about something, not so much because of what they're saying, but because of the way that they phrase certain things? That's what I was getting from Heather. At the end of the day, I just get the impression that she still thinks all of this is about her. Now, I could be way off the mark here. If you want to watch it for yourself, we've linked it in the description of this video. Just be warned, if you're like me, it will probably make you angry. With all that said, I don't want to just end this video on an angry note. So I'll say this. Regardless of how Christian Rojas died, of how his trust and kindness were exploited and abused in the worst possible way imaginable, we should never lose sight of the fact that he was trying to do the right thing. He was there for someone who he believed needed his help. In the end, the world needs more people like that. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.